Welcome to Hit the Brakes, where we dive into the top stories, market trends, and ins and outs of the supply chain. No matter if you're tuning in from the cab of your truck, behind your desk, or on your daily commute, we're glad you're here and we're ready to serve you. Let's get this show on the road. Welcome back to Hit the Brakes. I'm Mitchell Lewis, president and founder of Fetch Freight. Joining me is Brett Langford, our director of innovation and strategy here at Fetch. Today, we're going to cover supply conditions, demand trends, spot market behavior, a little bit of the tariffs, and then ultimately what we believe shippers should be preparing for over the coming months. First, we'll start with supply conditions, including capacity trends, carrier exits, and what's happening with trucking supply. Then we'll move into the demand conditions, where we'll look at how retail, industrial, and consumer freight are trending right now. And then after that, we'll talk about rates and spot market. Finally, we'll close with a forward look into the second half of the year and what shippers should be doing right now, stay ahead of the shift, if that's still possible, to probably respond to the shift as it continues to take shape. So, Brett, so when we look back into the first half of the year, we're pretty much six months in now. We look back to the first half. It's pretty much the inverse of what we've been seeing for the past few years. The story for several years has been excess capacity, very favorable conditions for shippers. Today, we're sitting in a whole new world. How would you describe the current capacity environment right now, Brett?
I'd say it's very different than what we've been discussing, over the last few Hit the Brakes podcasts and even our full year webinar forecast that we do every year. And the story up until this point is how to navigate this like tremendously soft market that we experienced for the last 3 years. And it seems like we woke up one day in Q4 and all of a sudden it was a new freight world. I think like November and December is really when we started feeling the tightening in the market, and that's just really accelerated since then. What we've experienced really during that run over the last like 6 to 8 months has been the fastest climb in spot market rates that we've ever experienced in the freight market. It's even challenging what we experienced and what we thought would never happen again back in the early days of COVID. Where today, if you're looking at even inclusive of fuel, all in, we're probably 30 to 40% higher than we were in the spot market last year. And if you strip out fuel, it's still 20 to 30% just on line haul. So some of those compounding factors, the Iran war and all that, has kind of turbocharged the start to this bull market rally that we're seeing in the trucking industry. But there's a lot of different factors that have been going on beneath the hood. I think we've been talking about a lot of these over the last couple sessions and market updates that we've given out. And a lot of what we talked about were the catalysts that led to this. This is truly a supply-driven recovery. Demand is, we'll cover all of that, but it's had some green shoots and things like that, but this is really more about the exit of capacity. We're not just talking about MC revocations and new MCs and all that, just carrier operating authority, but really like what's beneath the surface, what's actually driving the market. It's trucks, it's drivers. There have been just tremendous, downgrades of the capacity in those areas, and a lot of different factors adding up to it. We can kind of dive into some of those.
Yeah. Yeah. You tell me where I've got a list here of places to start right here. One thing that I think that we has been on the forefront of everyone's mind here recently is, and it's kind of a combo, is the SCOTUS ruling, the Supreme Court ruling, and I think that's having and will play out even further. It has some impact on capacity that people, the focus have been on their own workers and liability there, but I think it's also going to have some impact on capacity, and then insurance and the operating cost pressures that are impacting carriers. And I think those things kind of go hand in hand, and will continue to go to be more closely related in the coming quarters. But you care to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, no, those are some really good places to start. So like the SCOTUS ruling, everybody's talking about what's going to happen to the brokerage world, and is everybody going to go out of business and all that kind of stuff from a brokerage standpoint. But what the impact that I'm seeing less discussed is what's going to happen between brokers and their underlying carriers. with safety and vetting requirements now going up, basically for brokerages to insulate their risks, there's going to be a lot of carriers that are no longer getting used by a lot of these brokerages. So like the days of using a conditional carrier basically over. Fetch Rate has never used a conditional carrier. However, there are plenty of opportunities for those carriers to be loaded with freight, and I think those days are coming to an end. And then just the insurance subject is something that has accelerated even over the years leading up to this. Freight fraud and all of that has certainly impacted the cargo insurance market. There's a lot of insurers and underwriters that are getting out of cargo altogether, just because the losses have mounted up. And what I've also read is some research out there showing that the cargo insurance market at large, year over year, has continued to experience losses. So even the premium increases every year are not covering a lot of the losses the insurers are seeing. So that front is going to continue to see pressure on cargo insurance rate increases. And then liability too. SCOTUS ruling certainly kind of goes hand in hand with that. But like the days of the nuclear verdicts, you see a lot of pressure on liability policies as well. And then the third is diesel costs. Like that's one thing I think everybody in America is feeling it at the pump. And then if you look at diesel prices, even more expensive. But I do think that that's been helped out a lot by the spot market inflation. It's also been a part of why the spot market has gone up so much. Because of the balance in the market and all this capacity that's exited, the rise in fuel has effectively been able to be passed along in the spot market, which isn't always the case. But I do think the supply attrition we've experienced over the last 18 months leading up to this kind of teed that up.
Yeah.
Where fleets are actually able, I think, to kind of get by on the fuel side. But those cost pressures are certainly adding up to what we're experiencing today.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so much action right now on this fly side. I think that's kind of, it's been for 2-3 years. That's where the focus has been. The analysis on the flip side of that, of the deficit that we're starting to see on supply. So, the piece that we haven't really talked about, we talked about SCOTUS. That's but on the regulatory and enforcement side of the supply in the market. So the regulatory enforcement around drivers and carriers. It's not necessarily like all the headlines that we've heard a lot of conversation around ELP, the ELD side of it. There's a couple other things to mention here. So from what we're seeing, what's changing in how capacity is regulated and verified. That's a big piece, the regulatory piece in verification of these carriers.
Yeah, so I mean, what we've seen under the current federal administration is probably the most stringent and most aggressive FMCSA that we've seen, particularly coming from the prior FMCSA into this. I mean, it's like night and day, kind of what they're focused on and just how quickly they've been working to try to address these things. Some things not as fast as we'd hoped for, but English language proficiency obviously having an impact. The one that, I think we've talked about a lot over the last 2 years is non-domiciled CDLs. We've been exposed to that pretty heavily over the last couple of years of just, it was a new way of drivers to be able to enter the market that traditionally was not as big of a factor, but that has been one of the big catalysts for why the market stayed down as low as it has been over the last 3 years, was this influx basically, through immigration and basically new channels and new avenues for those individuals to get CDLs when they don't have a permanent residence inside the U.S. It just exploded, kind of the driver population and the barriers to entry for some of those individuals. And then, alongside that, there are some areas where many of these non-domiciled CDL drivers are working for lower wages than what we would traditionally expect out of the driver population, which contributed. I mean, labor costs are a huge part of of a truck operation. So, some of those tailwinds that came with non-dom CDLs actually helped hold down the rates over the last 3 years. And since the FMCSA putting the hammer down on non-domiciled CDLs in these different states, some of these states have ceased issuing them altogether. But we've seen tens of thousands of non-domiciled CDLs leave the market. That is one of the biggest factors from this. You mentioned English language proficiency. That is also a factor too. But the one that I think is really the other big factor is the ELD fraud.
That's what
Um,
that's the one that you're not hearing quite as much about. I feel like the folks have been on these the ELP, the not even saucy deal. We heard that in the headlines for a while now, but there's a lot that has been happening and continues to happen on the ELD side.
and I mean, even with the ELD fraud, it's a subject that I don't think a lot of people are super familiar with. But basically, up to this point, since electronic lighting devices became mandatory on these trucks, that there's a self-certification process, and that's like really where the problem lies. And we'll talk about CDLs too, because it's kind of a little bit of the same story. But ELDs, basically, a manufacturer, which there are dozens and at times available, I think it's even north of over 100 ELD devices, but they are self-certified by the manufacturer. Many of them manufactured in other countries, not the U.S. So say, hey, yeah, this ELD device works. It's good to go on board in a truck. That opened up a door, and I want to tell a quick anecdote that I think I just flabbergasted just hearing, but I think it paints the picture. Is during DOT Blitz Week, there's an article that came out, I think it was in Arkansas, where a state trooper had pulled over a truck, or they came through a weigh station, a trooper hut, to do their inspection. And the driver, the trooper checks the driver's electronic logging device in his truck, showed that he was out of hours of service, yet he's still driving. He goes back in the trooper hut, comes back and wants to take a screenshot of that ELD device. When he comes back, it's fresh on hours. Yeah. As the driver, what happened? The driver says, I have no clue. Yeah. My ELD device just sat. And that's a very common story we've heard, is that they're almost in a way that you can cycle a driver where it might be the same driver, but the ELD provider is doing things behind the scenes to keep that driver fresh and not legally. So I think that's been one of the really big impactful areas, is they've been decertifying a lot of these ELD devices.
It has artificial excess capacity, right there. Artificially meaning allowing drivers to drive beyond hours of service. And now the response has been the FMCSA to come in and decertify a lot of these devices to continue to do so, which does what to capacity.
Yeah, exactly. It's ribbing that kind of that artificial capacity. And the other thing that people are talking about too is the safety component. Is that driver fatigues, side is one of the top causes for driver fault or truck fault collisions and wrecks. And hey, if you're just going to keep driving and not resting, like, there's a safety component too that's really, really important there. Yeah. And similarly on the CDL side, self-certification of CDL stools was prominent during COVID and over these last 3 years. FMCSA has come in, I think they've closed, it was north of 50 CDL schools around the Southwest and Texas and along into California that I've read about. And I think that's happening probably even larger than that across the country. But this self-certification, obviously, it's the fox in the hen house, and not really incentivized to necessarily adhere to some of those requirements. Yeah. Just chasing commercial opportunities instead. Yeah. So that's been a great area that FMCSA has gotten involved in.
We throw one other point in here that we haven't even, I don't know if we've got time, but like, I know that we dedicated probably at least a good 15 minutes of our conversation about a year and a half ago on this topic, on cabotage. And I think we've finally seen some meaningful action on that as well. Again, anecdotal stories, but I think there was roughly, I think just about 2 weeks ago that I read an article where roughly 2,000 drivers, Mexican drivers, had lost their visa to enter the U.S. because they been parked. They actually cabotage inside the U.S. and picking up. As a reminder, cabotage is picking up in a non-domicile truck, a truck entering the U.S. From out entering into the U.S., picking up load in the U.S. and delivering in the U.S. So we're seeing more and more of those drivers that have been illegally operating in the United States, hauling freight. That capacity is also being made. So again, just continue to be more and more headlines that we're seeing, or more and more different areas that are having an impact on capacity. We've been talking about a lot of these. We've been talking about for 2.5 years. Pointed as the reason that the market wasn't behaving as we normally expected it to. Now it's seems capacity from a capacity standpoint, things have corrected themselves, but I don't know where they're going to stop. That's the other thing is what's, I think we'll get to that later on. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's surviving right now. Like, I don't take from capacity standpoint, I don't see them changing drastically anytime soon. Um, so paint the picture there. We've got a market that is vastly different than it was six last time we did this, like 6 months ago. Maybe we're just starting to see the change at that point in time that we established capacity is starting to contract it. So let's move over to demand. I think that's the other side, but we haven't paid as much as attention to here over the past or it hasn't made the headline as much in trucking at least. But let's talk about demand. What are some of the demand indicators looking like?
Yeah, I mean, like demand has had some interesting storylines, but it has really not been the dominant storyline. The again, supply-driven recovery,
Yeah.
is really the story here. However, I think some of the really important stories that are happening on the demand side. One, flatbed is just absolutely a hot area right now on demand, and a lot of that's AI driven. So the data center build out, all these announcements of data center deals and multi-billion dollar data center developments. There's a lot of infrastructure that's getting moved on trucks to deliver to those facilities. So a lot of steel and components and things of that nature. But the data center and also some in the energy sector too. There's been a lot of movement there too. But really the data centers, I think, are the big story dominating flatbed and really just like green shoots of demand and freight. And where is this going to take us? So I've seen forecasts of 12 to 18 months. The build outs, not going to slow down until then, but really it's tied and correlated to AI demand. And where are we at large in our country of AI demand, consumer demand, and adoption of artificial intelligence? That's going to drive more and more usage of these, more and more gigawatt based data centers are going to have to be developed to keep in even really ahead of AI demand. They're pre-building a lot of these data centers for anticipated demand, but nobody really knows where the demand for AI stops. So could be 12 months, could be 18 months, it could be multiple years. This could be also a cycle of kind of constant infrastructure developed for many years.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, going to be a really important area to look, particularly if you're a flatbed shipper. This is probably part of the pain you've been experiencing. The supply side has definitely contributed to the flatbed market as well, and just the rapid inflation we've experienced there. But AI data centers is definitely something to keep your eye on. The other thing I'll mention is just kind of consumer at large in the economy is that you hear the phrase the K-shaped economy, and that's being thrown around a lot. Is it's kind of like a tale of two worlds. Basically, those that are high disposable income earners and high net wealth individuals are really driving a lot of the economy, driving purchases of luxury goods and even a lot of the basic consumer goods and retail goods. But on the other side, the base consumer still is super, super resilient. Even in light of, rising debt levels on the consumer side. So like really when is like the base consumer really see a slowdown on spending? Like we haven't really experienced that yet.
Right.
Yeah, they've been extremely resilient. And then just on retail, I think the one thing to keep an eye out for is what's happening with inventory levels. So inventory to sales right now in the US is at its lowest point since the early days of COVID, probably around like 2021 when there were inventory shortages everywhere and all of that. So we are getting back to those levels, which is, I think is really teeing up an inventory super cycle,
Yeah.
of rebuilding. So that might be, I think, another green shoot opportunity for just freight demand at large. When the inventories get depleted and they have to restock, that drives a lot of freight demand. So I think that's one thing that we're keeping our eye on the demand front.
Perfect. There's so much we can touch on, but like look, one thing I do want to you know maybe it's just an old habit now, but I want to touch on tariffs. I do think that maybe it's just we're just circling back and closing the loop on that headline conversation that we've had for several quarters now or years. But like what do you see? What impact? I know we have refunds coming around the corner, so is there any anticipation that that's going to drive any demand?
I do think that, that it will, not even just what I think, but
Yeah.
what's being forecast is that a lot of these refunds should drive some stimulation.
Yeah.
And you have money going back in the pockets of importers here in the U.S. And
Yeah.
they say like the consumer paid for all the tariffs, yet the importers, the one that's going to be getting the refund checks. The problem is that the process of establishing those refunds, getting them back in the hands of those who paid those tariffs, is proven to be very, very difficult, very, very slow. Makes sense given just the magnitude of the situation, how many people were involved. I mean, the Liberation Day tariffs pretty much hit like everything and anything and everything.
Yeah.
So I think the refund challenge is definitely like kind of one of the stories there with tariffs. Like, I do think tariffs are becoming more and more of a footnote. Liberation Day was really bad, like just in terms of just the magnitude of it and the severity and just how much of an impact it had on business at large in the United States. But really now the latest story is around the 232 tariffs, which were kind of like national security, and some people call them the metals tariffs. That those were recently ruled as unconstitutional by a federal judge. That was every year in like the last few weeks. So more refunds probably expected, which we already know is a challenge. But I think the moral of the story here, just on like kind of closing the loop on tariffs, is that we're definitely in, I think, like kind of the later innings of the tariff story in general. Now, like the back end of getting refunds and all that, I think that's still going to be a process. But I'm seeing tariffs as a much smaller effect compared to what we've talked about in the last couple years.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. No, I appreciate it. I think it's worth just having a quick conversation on that. Just as fun as that has been for several years now. So, I guess let's just connect all the where we've discussed all the supply and demand side. Let's connect it into the market forecast. Let's build in there, and so we're zooming in on race right now. I think it's obvious that we're in an extremely inflationary market, and I think the big question we have right now is how far does this thing have to run?
Yeah, we are definitely in the early innings, is my opinion. So I think spot rates, again, we talked about how fast they've climbed, kind of record breakneck pace. Again, like roughly kind of 30 to 40% higher, inclusive of fuel, kind of all in spot rate. So kind of significant inflation. And I think it's been like a lot of whiplash probably for many of the shippers out there, especially kind of getting in the groove of the last 3 years of things being kind of quote unquote easy, where you're focused on saving money and bringing wins back to their organizations and cutting costs on freight. And now it's kind of the other side now. And a lot of people have forgotten that. And I think they're having to flex some muscles that, maybe haven't had to since really the COVID days. But I really want to talk about contract rates. So like spot rates, yes, obviously, exploded. Contract rates are now starting to see that effect too, with contract rates resetting this cycle roughly between like 5 to 10%. I think I've seen somewhere around like 7.5% is kind of the average increase on contract rates right now. And that's also being complicated because while you're getting increases via these RFP events and under contract, there's also been a lot of tender rejections, higher tender rejections than we've seen in years. So there's challenges even coming out of these bid events where maybe some of these bids are stale and is competing with other opportunities that these carriers have.
Yeah.
So I think the contract rates is a very big story, and I don't think that this is where it ends. So this is just kind of the early effects of the spot market increase is we're pushing double-digit increase on spot, which is our own contract, which is pretty significant. The other thing I'll say is that, when you look at seasonal patterns, produce season kind of was a whimper over the last few years. And that's usually something we point to as like a litmus test for the market is how does capacity respond during those seasonal demand periods like produce season. We've seen obviously much tighter produce season because it's kind of been compounded with the supply-driven recovery of the produce wave that's coming out. And the other one's really DOT Blitz Week. You have a couple of these a year. In the past, we've definitely seen some effects, like small blips, small spikes in spot rates during those DOT Blitz weeks.
Yeah.
But I think this week was where everybody realized we're in a different place.
Yeah.
Because DOT Blitz Week, from all accounts, was just an absolute bloodbath. Rates went through the roof, doubled, tripled on some lanes, and shippers deciding whether or not they're even going to ship product that week or not, and then that carried over into the following weeks too, with some effects. So I think those seasonal periods, and even you look ahead to Q4, I think those are other litmus tests in the market during these seasonal periods. I think are really important to really gauge like how far are we going and how fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like you sort of talk to there, speak to there, like this is the second half of the year, is really, kind of what everybody has their eyes on right now. Like we wrapped up, pretty much made it through the first half of the year, looking into the sort of the back half. What do we think is going to happen? Once we get through the quote unquote produce season, um, everybody thinks that hey, there's relief around the corner once you get through produce, but everything we're discussing is this has been mainly driven by a capacity exit. I think that's well established. Um, so we're looking, as we look ahead, we don't see any reason at all to think that that's going to slow down the exit of the capacity. It will slow down, but the FMCSA is going to keep their foot on the gas and enforcing the ELD decertifying non-compliant ELDs and just being very strict on way discussed notice, which is the new platform for onboarding carriers who I think, but what a headline I saw earlier this week was that onboarded like 0 carriers in the past 2 weeks, I think it is, which is shocking, and you have to believe they'll get that sorted out. But anyway, as a forecast goes, we're looking to the back half of the year. There's not very much reason to believe that there's going to be much relief anytime soon, right?
So
If anything, it may get a
yeah,
little bit different.
and I think here's the really interesting part is that we're really on this kind of 2 to 3 year bull market trajectory, and that's kind of how long I think it's going to last. About at least kind of 2 years of rate recovery, but counterintuitively, no relief in the back half. There actually might be a little bit of relief in the back half of this year, and it's driven by one thing: EPA 27 pre-buy. So there are emissions regulations that have already been communicated. They will continue to go into effect. The administration has confirmed that in 2027, new engines and new trucks must be compliant at a much more stringent emissions levels than current trucks and engines today. So what is a pre-buy? Trucking companies, who also up to this point have been extremely reluctant of even adding trucks to their fleets. It's been the opposite. It's been contracting fleets and kind of chronic low orders below replacement levels on the Class A truck and tractor side. But before the 2027 regulations go into effect, you have an opportunity to buy current generation trucks, which are going to be cheaper. The new emissions compliant trucks that are going to be required to be sold for all new engines, new trucks, starting in 2027, are going to be coming in at roughly around like a 10 to 15% increase over current truck costs. So to avoid having to buy those more expensive trucks, fleets will buy the current generation trucks right before the bell, which is going to bring in some new capacity in the market. That Class 8 supply level is really one of the biggest factors for driving the supply side of the market. And I just think that's one moment where we might actually get a little bit of like, maybe not a pullback in rates, but it might cool off on the inflation side.
Yeah.
As these new trucks are coming into the market ahead of the EPA 27. And then also, I think we're going to see a lot of activity on the used truck side as well. Just going for current gen trucks that are cheaper. But fleets, a lot of times these build orders, if you want new trucks, it could take 18 months before that truck from order to coming off the line. Could even take longer than that sometimes.
Yeah.
So I expect a lot of order activity here at the end of the year, and possibly even some trucks actually hitting the roads here at the end of the year.
Well, I look forward to seeing the active report here in another week or so. I think they do. Tim Denori, who obviously joins us here at least once a year for these our webinars at least. I look forward to seeing what the Class A truck order numbers are. They may have already released them, and I may have already missed it, but I know they come out about this time. I mean, I can look forward to hearing their take on that coming out as well. Yeah, so there's a lot of, let's recap there. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to believe, like the other side of this is you've got a little bit of relief maybe on capacity for the EPA 27 pre-buy, and there's some hope there if the balance sheets so the carriers can support bringing these trucks on. So it's probably will land with the larger fleets most likely, what I would anticipate there. But then if you had to simultaneously, if you have a recovery if you have a demand recovery on this inventory that was there so low right now, they could almost
Negate the
I guess
effects.
yeah. Right. So yeah, but it remains to be seen. But there's no reason to believe that there's any meaningful relief in rates, at least at the back half of this year. And our friends on the shipper side of the equation don't like hearing that, but I mean everything we're looking at, that's what we're saying is just it seems that it's going to be a while before there's anything made for relief to speak of. So
Absolutely.
let's see. So yeah, I think. Did you have anything else to add on that?
I mean, I think you really had it. I thought it was a great synopsis of kind of the situation we're in and what we expect to have happen. You know, not even just like for this year, but even kind of the road ahead.
Yeah.
Is going to be a very interesting one.
Yeah.
It's a multi-factor environment, so yeah. Well, one thing might help, one thing might hurt, and there's a lot of factors to assess about. You know, mentioning these just for the listeners and viewers of the
The
podcast.
last thing I think obviously important to we didn't focus on it too much. I do think it's worth making sure that we include the conversation of fuel prices, not just diesel and trucks, but on the consumer, just gas prices, oil prices. Even as we're meeting and talking today, I think there was a report of a helicopter, an Apache U.S. helicopter being shot down, and talk of digital response and escalations happening again. So if that continues, then these fuel prices are going to continue to go up, and that's going to hurt the consumer. So that's another thing that we'll continue to keep an eye on. But just as we wrap up today's mid-year check-in, what's the big picture? Tight market. It's been driven by capacity contraction. Demand is stable right now. There's room to grow, but there's also some other sides of things like we just mentioned that could have a detrimental impact on demand. So don't be surprised if the market either our thoughts here. Don't be surprised if the market either tightens in the coming quarters, it tightens further, which will be driven by the recovery of demand, or if rates remain elevated for a prolonged amount of time, just due to the continuing supply side constraints driven by regulatory pressure. So we think we firmly believe that we're in the early innings of an inflationary cycle and room to grow another year, or maybe even more. I think perhaps more in the multiple year of growth on the inflationary side of rates. And then, that's why we check in every 6 months, kind of keep an eye on this. So we'll do this again at the end of the year. And just want to, thank everyone for listening today, and thank you for spending your time with us. And as always, reach out to myself or anyone else here on the Fetch Freight team if you want to just see how this applies to your shipping strategies. And if you want to talk shop, then we're here. So thanks again for listening to this episode of Winter Breaks, and check out fetchfreight.com for additional resources. Thanks for joining us on Hit the Brakes podcast. Want to know more about today's episode? Visit fetchfreight.com to connect with someone from our team, get a quote, join our carrier network, and more. Check out the show notes below for specific links mentioned in the episode.